Now, most of you guys that were in my class last. Go through it again, just so that we can, like, I don't know, just see it in real life and sort of think about it together. So this is what your paper looks like in your kit, and this is your Stonehenge paper. Whenever you start to make a print, you're going to have your plate. That's going to be a particular size, and then you're going to start to look at your paper. Actually, let me. Can somebody grab my plate off the table? No, just the plate actually. So your plate's going to be a particular size thing. Your plate's going to be a particular size, and your paper is a particular size. So the first thing always that you want to do when you get to your paper is figure out how many pages am I going to get out of this paper, and what's the orientation of my plate on the paper. Remember that this is what we call the decal. That's the deckled edge of the paper. And remember that this decal is something, now this paper is 100% rag paper, specifically made for printmaking. It's paper that's made to be able to get wet so that it becomes really spongy and absorbent. And then that is what receives the print and all the tiny, tiny detail in the print. This decal is what tells us and your viewers how thick and to what quality the paper is. So this decal is sort of showing off how thick the paper is and what it's made of. So this is important to us. As printmakers, we like this deckled edge and we want to preserve it if possible. The decal always goes at the bottom of the page. We always want to be looking at our print and have that decal sort of hanging. It's all, you can almost think of it as fringe on a beautiful rug or something. You want to have that decal kind of hanging down at the bottom. That's one of the main mistakes that people make when they start to do their editioning is like, oh, I had everything perfect, but now there's one with the decal on this side, there's one with the decal on that side. It's difficult to sort of remember how to do that. So if you start from the beginning and set everything up properly, it's a little easier. Okay, so there's two sort of ways that we're going to talk about the preparing this paper. One is if your collage is made in sort of a landscape. I intend it to be this way. And then we're going to talk about a different orientation of paper if you intend it to be portrait. The portrait one is a little more difficult, but it's totally, but you guys are pros already, so you'll be able to handle it. I think that the easiest way in here, I'm going to show you 3 different ways to cut your paper. I think that the simplest way to cut the paper is right over here. But some people hate this, and so I'll show you a totally different way if you don't want to do it that way. So what I want to end up with for the landscape style of print is I want to end up with, my plate's 9 by 12. If anybody has a different size plate, let's talk about it after the demo and we can figure it out. My plate's 9 by 12. I want to end up with a paper that's 11 by 14 and the decal at the bottom. And I decided that because I sort of, I looked at my plate and I said, what's the largest size this way I could get? And then I matched it with the border on the right. So basically, like, I planned it out to say, what's the sort of balancing between, I want a nice border, I want a nice even border, but I also want to get as many sheets out of this page as I can. So that's what I came up with. 11 by 14 is the size of the paper, decal on the bottom. So the first dimension that I'm going to cut is I'm going to cut it at 14, and I'm going to get 2 of those out of this. So I'm going to cut it at 14, and I'm going to cut it at 14 again. So I take this guy over here. I have to lift the handle up as high as it'll go. There's inch measurements up at the top here. So I put my paper in right up against the inch measurements. There's also a grid on the sort of base of it. I line that up with the grid. I sort of, and remember, anytime I approach the paper, I make sure my hands are clean, and I try to touch it very lightly, because even just the oils from my fingers, even if my hands are clean, can sort of start to put fingerprints on the paper. So whenever I touch it, I'm just sort of gently lifting it. I'm just being careful with it. when I put it in here, I make sure it's all lined up, and then I sort of gently put my whole arm on the paper, because what happens is, just like when you're cutting with scissors, when you bring this down, it's gonna wanna draw the paper into it, and it's gonna wanna give you a slightly off angle cut. If you sort of brace the whole page with your arm, you'll kind of support it better in the cutter. And then I just cut down. The other thing that I do is I pull, as I'm cutting, I gently pull this toward the edge of the blade right there. It's kind of like when you have like dull scissors and you have to kind of squeeze it. That's sort of what's happening there. So I cut that one, and then I do this one at 14 as well, same thing. And I end up, I usually keep anything like this that I have. When we talk about monoprinting, it'll sort of be a little bit more important, but anytime I'm doing a test and I want to test it on the real paper that I'm using, I can use these scraps. So I like to keep these around. And then our next objective is, what was our next size is, oh, well, now I'm going to cut the 11. The decal, if I cut it at exactly 11, it's going to be a little off, because that decal actually stretches just above the 22-inch measurement that is the width of this paper. So what I really want to do is I want to pretend like the edge of the paper is just above the decal. So when I line it up in the cutter, I want to line sort of like the edge of the decal up with the line that's on the cutter. And then that's my okay, so that would be, and I want, in the end, I want an addition of 3. And I think that if you cut 4 pieces of paper, you'd probably be able to get your addition 3 out of it. If you made 4 prints, you'll get rid of the one that you don't like, and you'll probably have a good addition. So I think that's a good amount. So I have 3 cut edges and 1 deckled edge that will always go on the bottom. Now, what if my piece is oriented this way? It doesn't look good to have a decal on the side of your print. Well, I won't give you any more information on that. Don't have the decal on the side. In this case, what I would do is I would just take this over the cutter, because remember, we have that extra little measurement for the decal, and I would just cut off the decal. That's what I would do in this case. Now, if you want, there's a way to sort of trick and have a homemade, like your DIY decal on the bottom of it. And this is the way you do that. And some printmakers will only ever cut their paper this way. This thing that I'm about to show you now. To do that, you would take your paper and you would, Marcia, is there a pencil on the desk right over there? Oh, yes. Whenever you're marking your paper to cut, you guys probably notice class, you're always pencil. Pencil just erases right off the page. Never use a pen or anything when you're sort of measuring your material out. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to rip the paper, and that rip is going to become my decal. That's going to be as good as it looks a little different than a decal, but that rip is going to serve as my decal. So I want to end up with, so now to do my portrait style, I want to end up with 3 cut hard edges and 1 torn edge. So I'm going to make a torn edge at 14 inches. So this is the way you do it. We've got these nice gridded boards on the table over here. And we also have a very heavy ruler with a very sharp edge. And that's what I'm going to use to rip my paper. So I'm actually going to use my other piece of paper to measure my 14 inches. But you could also, there's also rulers over here. There's a ruler. You can do that too. Just with a pencil, I'm going to make 2 lines where 14 inches is. 2 lines. And then I'm going to put my ruler, my sharp ruler. The ruler has sort of a beveled edge that goes down like that. You want the sharp edge to be touching, I don't know if you can see that, but you see the beveled edge. You want the flat side to be on the table. And I put this right here. I line it up with my my ruler. And you can also double check your kind of squareness by taking the grid of the board and lining up your paper with the grid of the board. That's another kind of a way to double check and make sure you're not putting a weird angle into it. Sometimes it's a little easier if you see this thing that's sticking out, it's like preventing me from like getting right up against it. I'm going to move that up a little bit so that I can get right against it. And I hold down very firmly, and as much as sort of a confident motion that I can make, I'm just going to take the top and I'm going to start to rip down. What I mean by a confident motion is that you want, like a really great printmaker will do it and do it in like one. It usually takes me 3 or 4 to sort of get it. And now I have one ripped edge. And so then I'm going to take it over to the cutter. I'm going to do a, what did I say, 11. And then I'm just going to cut off my decal. My decal is just going to be gone. And that way, I end up with 3 hard edges and 1 ripped edge that's sort of my own decal that I made. So that's the way that it's going to look for portrait style, and this is going to be the way that it's going to look for landscape style. And always, no matter what size your plate, no matter what size your, what kind of thing you're printing, you always want to start at this table and really just think through the process. How many pages can I get out of one sheet? Where is my decal going to be? All of that stuff. Just spend some time making it perfect in the beginning. And that way, when you get to the end, you'll have enough prints and it'll all be perfect. So the extras go back inside your drawer. And as many pieces of paper as I think I'm going to be able to print today, I'm going to put them in the sink to soak. So I say that I'm going to do 3 today. So I'm going to take 3 pieces and I'm going to put my initial in pencil on the back of them, so that when I put them in the sink, everybody will know whose is whose. Okay, sometimes this gets a little tricky. The paper does have a front and a back, and I'll tell you how to distinguish them, but also it doesn't totally matter. This paper looks really good on both sides or whatever, so it doesn't totally matter. But if your eyes are good, you can detect what the front and the back is. The front of the paper, the surface of it, it's called the tooth of the paper, and it looks like the surface of the moon. Sometimes if you hold it with the light coming down like this, you can see it. Sometimes if you just look really carefully, you can see. You can also look through a magnifying glass and see it. It looks like the surface of the moon. The other side, the back of the paper, sometimes will look like a grid, like a screen. And that's where the paper was made, sort of, that's where it's soaked into the kind of bed that where they made the paper. The other way to tell in this particular, the one that we bought, is that the decal has sort of a harder, it's easier to see the ridge where the decal ends on the back of the paper. So I don't know if you can tell, but the front of the paper, it just seems to smoothly go into the decal. The back of the paper, I can sort of see this line where the paper ends and the decal starts. That's the back. So on the back of the paper, I'm going to write ML, ML, ML. And I'm going to take it over to the soaking sink. So why don't we come over? When you put your paper in the soaking sink, you're just going to gently, with the initial side up so that you can see it when you come over, you're going to gently put the paper in, and one by one, you're going to cover it completely with water. Then there it is right there. You're going to do the next one right on top of it. That way, multiple people, instead of just sort of letting them float all throughout, all of your paper, ML's paper, is going to be in one neat stack over at the corner here. Now remember, when the paper's in the sink, anything that happens to it, it's going to remember. Somebody comes over and lifts it and it rips a little bit. Somebody comes over, it's more likely that it's going to get a fingerprint, a rip, when it's sort of gently sitting in the water over here. So when you come over here and there's 10 people's paper in the sink, just breathe deeply just become a Zen, like monk, come over and just very carefully get your paper out. Try not to get frustrated. Also try to understand that it's a busy place. If your paper does get damaged, let's talk about it. Maybe I have an extra piece. Maybe we can figure something out. Just be careful of other people's work. Be compassionate that this stuff is expensive and everybody's paper is in here together. So just calm yourself and calmly look for your paper. Sometimes it sort of scoots around a little bit when everybody's moving around, but just put it in a stack, put your initials on it, and now it's going to be left here for 20 minutes. I think it's enough time to deal with your paper first, slice it all up, and I think 20 minutes is a good amount of time to start your inking process, make sure your pressure is correct. It can be in there for up to like 3 hours. So you can really you can come in at the beginning of the day, put your paper in there, and then, I don't know, do a drawing, have some coffee, think about it. It could be in there for almost the entire class period. The longer it's in there on a busy day, however, the more likely somebody came over to get their paper, there's a fingerprint on it now. It got ripped because somebody licked their paper out. So I would say between 20 minutes and an hour is probably as much as you want to do in there, but you're not ruining it if it's in there for 3 hours. It's gonna be fine. So now let's go over and talk about ink. Okay. You also might want to write your initials. I would just say everything that you have, your gloves, oh yeah, there you go. Your gloves, if you bring your own roller, anything that's yours, take your Sharpie and write your name on it. All of our stuff for this assignment is going to look pretty similar, especially when it's completely covered with ink. So just, write your initials on everything. So the first thing I do before I start to get my ink out is that I'm going to make a little template. Okay, so now we've prepared paper. We did that. We soaked our paper. And now we're in the stage where we're going to prep the ink area. Prepping ink area. It's for our television audience. Okay, so what I did before class is I made myself a little template for how I'm going to print my print. I'm going to put this down in the same place every time, and I'm going to put my paper in the same place every time. And I've just taken this piece of paper. There's a whole stack of this kind of paper right under here. You're free to take one to use as your template.
The plastic one we had it, can we use it? Remember with tape that kind of guiding it?
Great question. Your plastic, we're going to use that later in the semester, but that thing is going to change the thickness of your plate.
Okay.
And these presses are going to be set to the perfect pressure to have everybody printing.
Got it.
If you put something in there that's a 1/16 of an inch thicker, it's going to change the pressure. So I would use this. You can draw out where your plate's going to be, and then draw out where your paper is going to be. Mine is 1 inch, or yours should be 1 inch border all the way around, with a tiny bit extra on the bottom, because remember that decal is actually 1/4 of an inch longer than the edge of the paper. So that decal is going to be down here. This side is just a tiny bit longer. So every time I take this over to the press, this is going to go down, and then my paper is going to go on the top of that. This might get dirty after a time, and I'm just going to keep, whenever I go over to the press, I'm going to keep this, and I'm going to go over to the press and then take it back. We're going to have the ink set up on these tables, and there's going to be a lot of people moving around. So this is sort of like your little workstation that's going to go over to the press each time that you use it. So you might want to write your initial on that too. Anywhere where the, I don't know if it was my hair. Anywhere that the paper is going to touch, you want to be really aware of what's inside that margin area. If you put a Sharpie marker right there, the paper will pick that up. So I've just put pencil. So if it does transfer onto the paper, I can just erase it. So now this is going to set aside for a minute. And now I'm ready to ink my plate. I'm going to wear my inking gloves for this part. And And oh, actually, Mila, okay, so what I have out on the table, this is gonna be for when I wipe away the ink. It's gonna be for when I roll it out. And this is gonna be for mixing the ink and getting it out of the cans. Mila, you don't need anything extra. I think we have it all here because I have that. This is the ink that we're gonna use for the collagraphs. It's etching ink. Oh, wait, that's not it. This is etching ink. This is the etching ink that we're gonna use for the collagraphs. Most of the time, when you come in to print, this will be mixed, like on a big work day when we're all working together, this will be mixed for you and ready on the table. Ask Martin and Britta, is this for collagraphs? Make sure it's the right sort of consistency. You might want to ask either Martin or Britta whether it was mixed for collagraphs. But for the most part, if you see a dollop of ink on the table, that'll be what we're working with today. And Martin will mix a couple dollops to be used on this table today. But I want to show you what it's made of and how, if you ever had to come over and mix it yourself, I want to show you how that's done. So this is the etching. Oh, sorry. You put the white compound in here. Okay, so this is just ready to go.
Could be, but you could add a touch.
Okay, cool. So this right now behaves a little bit like your Akua ink from last year. But your Akua ink is water-based. Remember, you could wash it off with soap and water in the ink. This is not water-based, this is oil-based. This is what the Akua ink is trying to imitate. This is the original stuff. The Akua ink is a pretty recent product. It was sort of developed in the last like 10 years. This stuff, the recipe for this stuff is hundreds of years old. This is the original sort of printmaking ink that all of that stuff is trying to like imitate. So this is the real stuff. It also costs, Martin, what does this cost? 20 bucks, yeah. Depending on the color, this is like $20 a can. I guess your Akua ink was expensive too, but so just remember to use this sparingly. Just think about it as a thing of value. And the other thing about it is that unlike your Akua inks were made so that they never really dried until they hit the paper. Remember how sort of, even if you had a little like blop on the outside, remember it's probably still wet to this day. These things actually dry. So the way that they dry is that there's usually an oily kind of consistency on the inside of the can, and it'll develop this skin on the outside of on the top of it, and that's the dried ink on the top of the surface. Maybe if you've worked with oils, you notice that, like there's sort of a skin that develops. So if you ever open a new can of this, and this is, if you do this at home, if you want to sort of get into this, the thing to do is to peel back that skin that's on the surface of your ink and preserve it so that you can put that skin back over it in the end. You can sort of use that skin almost like an interior cover. The thing that you don't want to do, and so you want to be really careful when you come over to a new can of this and sort of think about how you're going to get that oily ink out of the center of it. What you don't want to do is just gouge into the can and leave like a huge, we'll look at some of the other inks and we can see like what happens when you gouge into the can. If you leave a hole in the can, then that skin forms in like a hole, and then you've sort of wasted that whole surface area. You've wasted a little bit of ink. It's better if you sort of take off what's on the surface of the can and just use that as your ink. This one is it's harder to see. I'll show you in one of the other cans, like what I'm talking about. This one is sort of mixed up a little bit. Martin already put in the Easy Wipe compound, which is in this can. And this actually makes it behave a little bit more. This is like, looks just like peanut butter. I always get like a little hungry when I look at it. It's like peanut butter and jelly, actually. This one is going to make it behave even more like our Akua inks. And it's going to sort of change the consistency of it, make it a little bit easier to roll out onto my plate. So, and you said that you've already put a little bit in there, right?
I did, yeah.
Okay. So I sort of like the consistency of this. You might want to sort of, actually, maybe I'll put just a tiny bit more.
think, most of the time, this will be the consistency for what a lot of it actually is. And then again, what we do with the easy white is kind of like a personal preference of how we use the ink. You can never make it too loose because then it's going to run out, but
Right.
to some extent, you can kind of really personalize the ink, which is
Right.
fun.
Yeah, yeah, as you start to get like different techniques and stuff, and you know how you want it to print, you can change that around. I'm just gonna put a tiny bit more in there. And I think it's always a good idea to sort of, when you get over to the table, just take the palette knife and sort of, I don't know, work with it a little bit and see how, now you can feel these, there are some like pieces of skin from the, from the surface that dried that are still in this ink. You'll see it when we start to roll out the ink, but those you'll want to pick out if they end up in your like palette. So I'm sort of working that easy white compound into the, I'm doing this right here because Mila and I are both going to use this area. This little blob of ink will be in the center of all the tables and everybody will just use it communally. You don't need your own blob of ink over near your plate. You can, use the one in the middle. So we're going to be inking this. So now we're going to ink the plate. Our television audience here, inking the plate. We're inking the plate. I don't know why I thought that would be helpful, but it's an idea. Okay, so we're going to be inking the plate in two different ways. The first way is like the way that you ink the plate in our relief class. We're going to be rolling it out on the table and inking the high parts of the plate. For most people, this is kind of easy. So I'm going to make a little area of ink the same way that I do for my relief. I'm going to try to take a little bit of those little chunks out of it as I do that. And I'm going to start to roll it out. Remember that you want this square of ink, just like we did last year. You want this square of ink to be as even and without any kind of big blobs as possible. So I'm just rolling that out as evenly as I can.
So it's the peanut butter thing, like is that kind of like water with acrylic?
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, it's thinning it out. So now I've got a nice square of ink. It's like the surface of it is like velvet. I see like a little corner of skin in there. Oh yeah, you're right. There's two of them. And I can just sort of pick those out. It's not going to ruin my life, but if I can get it now, I might as well. And then I'm going to transfer some of that onto the surface of the plate. Now, this, in this phase, my plate's pretty delicate. There's a lot of things that are like not totally glued down perfectly. So I'm going to sort of be aware of them as I ink it. In this phase, it's kind of like what you see is what you get. If it's dark on the plate, it's going to print dark. If there's white areas or cardboardy looking areas, it's going to print like that. This is the last time we're going to see the plate in this state because our next printing process is going to look really different. So you only really have, you can kind of get back to this point, but this point is sort of a unique part. And it's our next like sort of style of inking is a lot more difficult than this. So you have one shot in the easy way. And I'm just going to sort of I'm going to try to do like, and you also, there's some nuance to it. Like if I want, the high parts are now picking up ink. Like I cut, my little like photo collage part, that's definitely picking up ink. So I want to make sure and get that nice and dark. But then I also have some areas, I'm going to try to have a dark sky and a dark kind of bottom of the print, but I'm going to try to keep my horizon line sort of light. So it's not just that I'm inking up my whole plate. It's that I can see what I'm getting. I can see where it's dark and light, and I'm kind of fussing with the darks and lights. I'm keeping some areas preserved with light, and I'm going darker in other areas. So there's a little bit, even in this stage, there's a little bit of nuance with how you ink your plate. And then of course, there's some areas, because I have high things right here, there's some areas that are just not getting inked at all. And that's good. I want some areas on the plate to stay white. So, Mila, you want to start inking yours?
Yes, sure. May I borrow your gloves?
Oh, yeah, please. And I think, and Mila, I think you're sort of in the same, like you might want to like,
Yeah,
a
I see
dark
that.
sky and sort of think about that. Let's see what happens when Mila does it. And this is sort of, so if anybody wants to get in close and look at that.
Yeah, if we want to add more, maybe, sorry. If we wanna add more plate, even when it's wet like that, it'll dry.
Okay, once you've inked, this is a good question from Hannah about adding to the plate afterward. If you ink your plate, it now has that oil-based layer on it, and it's going to be harder to glue something onto the surface of it. But you can actually, like, if you had like a collage element that you wanted to put in, like in some ways, like it doesn't even have to be glued down. It's sort of, and there's another, you could also subtract from the plate pretty easily by like ripping things off of it and taking off of it. So I would say the only thing that doesn't totally work once it's been inked is taking like Elmer's glue and gluing it back on. I mean, sometimes it does, but it's trickier. Yeah.
And also, this is actually more of like, more geared towards my plate, so I'll ask you after.
Why don't you ask it now? We have time.
I didn't realize that I got my kit after the flood, so it was all kind of like in separate things. So I used the wrong thing as the back.
That's okay. You have plenty of that. That other stuff is
like the other, like the
yeah,
thinner
that's
ones.
fine.
I use that.
okay, but you still have some of that left, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. We might have to talk about that again because when we're going to be sending that to PrintFX.
Is that stuff like expensive? Okay, that's fine.
It's not that
Cause yeah, because it came in, I think all of them probably, it came in like a drawing.
Right,
like
right.
this. So when I opened it, I didn't see the cardboard because it was all cardboard.
right.
And then when I opened it this morning, I was like, oh my God, where'd this come from?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
That looks great.
Can this fabric well or no? Will it get like?
Fabric is really great because you'll see, and actually Mila has some.
Yeah, I do.
Mila has some fabric in there. It does fabric really well, and you don't even have, in some instances, you don't even have to glue it down. It's just like you can sort of keep it like loose. Yeah, fabric is great.
Well, what if I want to like print it on fabric?
Oh, print on fabric.
Yeah.
It does work. And actually, I can show you an artist. I usually show her next semester, but I'll show you an artist who prints on canvas.
Oh.
And it looks great. And anytime you're printing on fabric, you're losing a little bit of detail because the paper just has so much. The paper is just so absorbent or whatever. So the fabric is giving you its own detail, which, sometimes you have to work with or against. Okay, so now our next step is, this is going to be, we're going to use this printing press. So our next step is to come over and set up our plate. I think it's usually, and so anytime I'm doing a plate, I've got my gloves on. Anytime I'm doing, remember, my gloves are now inking, my paper is now. And in this way, I can use gloves over by the inking station. My hands are pretty clean, and I'm just going to carefully sort of move it into position there. And now this is ready to go. I've already done something here that's going to be a problem, so I want to show you how to solve it. When I move my plate, I left a little inky line right there. So that is now going to print in the margins of my paper. So an easy way to get around that is that I'm just going to rip a little piece of paper, and I'm going to put this right, well, that has a little bit of Sharpie on it. I'm going to put this right here over that it's just a little trick so that I don't end up with that inky thing in the margins of my paper. So that's going to, and just make sure that those little strips end up like in the garbage can, not all of them. So that thing is ready to go. I'm gonna move it into position, and now I'm gonna go get my paper. So why don't we walk, yes,
I have a question.
yes,
I just like, because I see this is like a plastic.
yeah.
Why do we need paper? Why we cannot put the, just to see where
You-
to put the paper?
You might, at some point in your printmaking lives, dispense with this piece of paper altogether and learn to use this grid itself as your printing surface. I think for the purposes of having like many people in the class at the same time, it's a little easier to do it this way. But some people and good printmakers will just take this and put it directly on the plastic and measure it exactly. And they get a good idea of like, okay, that's an inch border. I'm gonna line my plate up there and my paper up there. And they get real good at just thinking, it's like they think of this grid is like in their heads. They just know exactly how to do that. And there might be times when later in the semester, when you get used to this, where you dispense of this piece of paper altogether and you can line it up directly with the grid. And it's true. It's a lot easier in some ways to line it up directly with the grid.
Yeah, you just wipe off the black thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and the press has to be really clean for you to, be able to do that. Okay, so, but for now, I would sort of suggest that everybody make this template and just use your own template when you come over the press. So I'm lining that up perfectly, and now I'm gonna go fuss with my paper. So let's go see what it looks like over here. So now here's what I'm gonna do. My hands are pretty clean. Maybe I'll give them a little rinse. My hands are pretty clean. I'm going to get one piece of paper out and I'm gonna blot it in my towel. So lifting from the corner. And I'm holding my paper pretty gently. Remember, like even the oils from my fingers can put a fingerprint on it. So I'm holding it pretty gently. And I'm letting it drip out before I take it to the towel. I'm letting the water run off. Then I put it inside this towel and I blot it off. We worked with wet paper last semester, right? So hopefully this is a little easier. We sprayed it, yeah. So hopefully you'll find this to be a little easier than spraying it, and it'll get your paper nice and evenly wet. When you take it out of this towel, you want your paper to be wet, but not shiny. If you see a sheen of water on the surface of the paper, it's still too wet. So when I pick it up now, I want to make sure that the surface is damp, but I don't want to see any water sheen on it. That was just looking at the side that I'm actually print with, that was pretty good. So now I'm going to take it directly over. I'm going to line it up with my lines that I made on the paper, and I'm resting it right down. I sort of messed that up a tiny bit. Let's see if I can. And now I'm going to put a piece of newsprint on the back of it. And maybe we could cut, we actually could use this. I'll cut some in half because we don't really need that. What the newsprint does is that it protects this blanket if there's any over, this plate doesn't have like that much ink on it, but you might run into a part where ink squashes out from underneath it. I'm working with color, things got crazy. This protects the blanket from any ink that could spill out. And now I put my blanket on the, I tuck it in. And now I start to run it through. You should be on the side of the press where the handle is. This should be evenly lined up. You can give it a little bit of a nudge into the, with your hand into the press. And then the blanket catches under the roller. And now I can control it all with the roller. It's an even motion all the way through. I can feel when the roller starts to go over the chipboard. It gets a tiny bit harder to, you can hear it sort of squashing. It gets a tiny bit harder to move. But it should never be so hard that I have to really like use both hands or put my back into it. If it's ever so hard that you feel like you're really pushing, stop and ask Marcia and Britta if maybe the pressure is too tight. The danger is that if you put something really like, I didn't realize there was a label on the button or something, like you didn't realize how thick it was, especially with polygraphs. It's sometimes you don't realize how thick it is and the press will literally stop and it doesn't want to go through. Don't force it, just back it back out and see what was maybe preventing it. The danger is that you could chip this drum and then everybody's print will have like a little white chip in it because there'll be like a little hole in the drum. There also could be some other dangers. You might send something flying across the room and like shoot somebody's eye out or something. Just never, you never want so much force that you're like, eh. It should always be pretty easy. And it's just a direct motion. Once it's in there, you don't want to stop and go backwards. You don't want to stop and like, check your phone. You just want to go all the way through in one motion. And now. So you can already see the embossment on the back of it. You can already see that really beautiful embossment of that whole plate. And remember when we were doing this with spoons in our studio. Oh shit. I think my glue glued my paper.
I have a Mod Podge all over.
You have Mod Podge all over.
Yeah.
All right, I might have to alter my directions to you guys here.
But what's much fun?
Is water-based. Oh my gosh.
Water, well, I don't know. I also might.
It doesn't
May-
look bad.
Well, it doesn't look great.
Just water, yeah. The paper is sucked in on water, right? Oh no, I'm gonna have the same thing.
You might have the same thing. And also, another thing that we might do is soak our paper for less time.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll figure that out. Okay, so now we can see, we're gonna figure out this problem of ripping so that it doesn't happen to you. But now we can start to see the effects of the collagraph. And remember, this is in the relief, this is relief inked. So that the ink is in the high part of the plate. Remember, decals at the bottom. And really, I was sort of trying to maintain this light view on the horizon and then sort of dark sky, dark water reflected in there. That ripping is a problem. It might have something to do with the glue that I used. I might have soaked the paper too long. I might back the pressure off very slightly. But by the time you guys are doing this, we'll have it figured out. And so that is the very first way that we ink the paper. I also, so I would give myself maybe like a B- for this. I don't like that ripping, but also I got a few fingerprints in the margins. Let's talk about that for a minute. And we did, and you guys will sort of remember this from last year too. There's some kind of inconsistencies and I don't know, smudges and obscurities that I like, and there's some that I don't like. That I don't like, that fingerprint I don't like, that fingerprint I don't like. This thing over here, where the cellophane kind of like escapes the side, I kind of like that. I like sort of having an uneven border. There's certain things about that that I think are interesting. This little unevenness where where it's not quite a square, I like things like that. The fingerprint is not good. But if you get something like that, don't worry about it yet. Put this on the drying rack. Wait till it comes back to you completely dry. If you try to fuss with that now, you'll make the problem bigger. I might be able to erase that with a really nice eraser after the print is totally dry. But if I try to do anything to it now, I'm going to make it worse. So I'm going to set that aside. So this goes on the drying rack. I asked Marcin, and it might have had to do with like
Hold
picking.
this up.
What was that?
Hold this up.
Do you recognize it,
I
Marcin?
do, of course. That's why I want to see it. Are they aware of it?
No, I don't know. I had a performance in the Hudson River this last Friday. And I was in this boat that had all this like chimes and stuff dangling from it. So this is in anticipation of that, I made this print of it. Okay, so now I asked Marcin, which drying rack should we
Which one
use?
you like?
Let's use, I don't know, maybe we should use that
There
one.
you go, that one.
That one, okay. So I take it over the drying rack. And I leave it there. So remember, everybody is we're all gonna use one drying rack, well, until it sort of runs out. We're gonna use one drying rack, and we're gonna ask Marcin which one we use for the class. Because then at the end of the day, March, or in 3 days when they all dry, Marcin takes everything from this drying rack and he puts it in the folder that's labeled Marie
Tuesday.
Tuesday, 9 to 1. So that's our class, Marie, Tuesday, 9 to 1. So as long as your print ends up on this drying rack where all of ours will, it'll end up in that folder. And then the next day, 2 days later, you can come in and get it out of that folder. So that's important. Okay, let's go back and do one more style of printing. And actually, you know what I'm gonna do? Yeah, maybe for this one, I'm gonna only soak the paper for just a minute right before, but let's not worry about it quite yet. This thing I'm gonna keep by me because I'm gonna use this in a minute. And this thing is gonna come back and get ink again. So that was the relief style of inking. The ink is sitting in the high parts of the plate and the low parts of the plate. Now I'm going to try to get the ink into the low parts of the plate and let the high parts of the plate be white. And that is the beauty and the nuance of the Collagraph. You can do both. So now what I'm going to do, I like to start out with it inked. And this takes a little bit of time. So that first one is usually really beautiful. People fall in love with it. This next one takes time, practice, and a little more care. So now I'm going to put even more ink on it. My plate is also like, oh yeah, I've got all that paper. I want to be careful of that. This will be our like garbage pile over here. Oh yeah, look at that. That's all that paper. We'll see what happens. Hopefully that's going to come on. I can even like take some of it off with that. Well, sort of, maybe not.
Pressing in.
So this, remember I made that little photo collage thing. That's sticking off of the plate like a 32nd of an inch. That's the high part. And that's black now. The low part is down below that in the depression between those things. So that's the low part. And that right now has no ink in it yet. But I'm going to try to get the ink down there and then I'm going to wipe it off the high part, just like we did in Intaglio. And this will be familiar to you guys because of the solar plate, because of all of our Intaglio stuff. Now I'm doing the opposite of the relief. So I want a lot of ink on there. And now comes the Intaglio part. I'm going to take a piece of chipboard. You could use chipboard. The other thing that sometimes works is to use a brush. This there's a inside that the cabinet, the sort of brown cabinet next to the cat. There's pieces of chipboard in a drawer labeled chipboard, and there's also brushes. If you guys choose the brush method, just try, like, find a crappy brush to use because we're going to get it. It's hard to clean this really nice black ink completely off of the brush. And there's some brushes that have already been used for black ink. So just be aware, don't grab like the biggest, most expensive brush for this one yet. I'm going to put a little bit more of this. Now what I'm going to do, the overall what I'm doing here is that I'm putting the ink on and then I'm going to wipe it off. So the Easy Wipe compound is actually going to be really good for helping me wipe the ink off of the surface of the plate. So I'm going to put, especially around, I really want to make sure that I get a nice amount of ink around my little boat character thing. Now I'm driving the ink into the low parts of the plate. And it just takes time. It's almost like I'm making a painting, almost like I'm making a monoprint or a painting, except that everything I'm looking at right now is black. So sometimes it's hard to know whether I'm like, if I'm doing anything, because everything is, it's really hard to see what is remaining black and what's not. The other thing that I can do, I like this sort of consistency of this easy white compound here. So I'm going to use this some more. This is going to be left out for anybody that's doing, and I'm going to take my chipboard just like I did with my solar plate. And now I'm going to be driving the ink into the low parts of the plate and wiping it off the high parts. It takes time, and it's hard to know exactly what you're getting. It's also a huge mess. The nice thing about at this stage is that this ink takes a really long time to dry. It's not like your Akua ink where, I mean, the Akua ink almost basically never dries until it touches paper. This actually does dry, but it takes a really long time. So I'm going to drive the ink into the low parts of the plate using a lot of that compound, easy white compound. My professor label is really bugging me now. You guys know who I am. So I'm gonna maybe leave this part a little lighter. It's mostly this part that I'm gonna do intaglio style. So now I've driven the ink into the low parts of the plate. Now I'm gonna try wiping the ink off of the high parts of the plate. This is called a tarlatan. This is something that we didn't have. This is like essential to intaglio. And we basically, when we were doing our, with our Akua ink and our solar plates and stuff, we were just using like paper towels as this. But now you have this magical material in the shop, and it's called a tarlatan. And it's really good for wiping the ink off of the high parts. And that's what I'm doing next. Also, if you have any, like I do, any areas where there's things that are really loose on the plate, this thing will want to rip those off. So you want to be just really careful with how you just want to be gentle. So now you can see a little bit. If you guys want to get in close there, you can see, especially in that area, that the ink is leaving the high parts and it's settling in the low parts. At least in that area. I'm going to do a little here. The other thing about the tarlatan is that I might make a little smaller one. When you come over to get your these tarlatans, it's actually kind of good if I'm going to make it smaller so I can. As the whole class is using these things, these will become darker and darker as the class uses them. It's actually good when they're dark, because if I'm just starting out wiping, it's easier to wipe if I use a dark part of the tarlatan and start out in the with that. So now I'm wiping just like my solar plate. I'm wiping all that stuff off. It's sort of hard to see what I'm getting at this stage because everything is so dark. But once I make a print, I'll be able to see sort of what works and what doesn't. Okay, let's try that. And this tarlatan, they live in that that sort of beige tray above the flammable cabinet. And when you pick them out, you know, you'll want to find one that has some dark part, some light part. And as you're using it, you're saying, okay, there's a dark part, I'm going to use that first. And then you're like, actually, I want this to be as bright as possible. So then you take the same tarlatan, you move it to sort of a lighter spot, and you can really sort of polish that up. If there's any parts that you want really, really white, you can take just a piece of paper, a piece of newsprint, and you can polish that completely off and try to get it back to completely white. You can try. We'll see what happens. Sometimes you have to sort of look at how the print's coming out to know whether that's working and stuff. Okay, so now I'm ready to print again. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just take one piece of, before I set up my press, I'm just gonna go over to the sink and I'm gonna put a piece of paper in fresh so that it's not quite as soaked. Let me see, we'll see if that. That's just gonna have been there for a few minutes. Now the press works in either direction. So it's busy, everybody's printing. I actually don't have to wind it all the way back through to the other side. I can just use this side and send it back through the other direction. This thing usually lives up here on top of the press because I can just easily use it out. As long as it didn't get really messy with ink, that's gonna be just fine. I might just back the pressure off slightly. You should, if you should ask, we in class usually don't have to mess with these things. That's sort of Marcin and Britta's domain. So so if you feel like the pressure is too much, too little, you can ask Marcin to tune it with you. But I just back the pressure off. Just I think that might have been part of the problem with that with my thing there. So I've got my template on there, and now I'm going to put my plate on.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
So I'm not good with putting a paper on top of the plate or plate on top. So we usually, I kind of like tape the
Right.
paper and just flip the door because I'm not good when putting just like how you do it. Forward. So I was trying to usually tape it and then just flip it on top. That's why I know it's gonna lay.
You could do
flat.
something like that. I mean, you would, it seems like if you were gonna try that, you would be doing that before you came over to the press.
Right.
It might be tricky because now you have wet paper, but you could try that. You could like you could take your wet paper, tape it to your template before, flip it up. I mean, I guess I would sort of like encourage you to practice some methods where maybe you lift the paper up and hold it with your hand as you put it down, like, but you know, figure out a thing that works for you. I think you also have to like now when everybody's in the room, you have to figure out like you had your style that worked for you in the privacy of your apartment or whatever. And now it's a busy place, everybody's moving around. You sort of have to figure out all your tricks, but figure out how to like get in there and do it a little fast. Okay. But yes, if that works for you, you could probably figure out a way. So I still have my same problem where I've got some marks in my margins, and I'm just gonna take, I'm gonna do the same thing that I did before. I'm just gonna take some paper and try to cover those marks. Just so that I don't. Okay, that's that. My paper hasn't been soaking for very long, so let's just see how that works. I'm gonna go there. Yeah, I guess what I do is I line up the side, right, and then kind of, you're right, like even that, and then I'm sort of watching it as it's going back over.
But then when it's laid down and you see like.
Really off, yeah. And you still have a little bit of leeway that you could, that you can move as long as it didn't touch too much and only in the print area. No, I'm confident that you. So now, and the nice thing about sort of starting it out, pushing it in, you can sort of see which direction the handle wants to go. Then it catches and the handle can start to move through. one even motion, trying not to stop or slow down in the middle. Not the end of the world if you slow down or something, but as even as you can make that motion. And then
That's why it's hard to compare.
I'd like to compare. the two things so you really see the difference between the two kinds of people. You know that. The main difference you can see is the boat. Oh, did I flip that around? Oh, I think I made it upside down. Okay, so the main thing is the boat. You can see that the boat is that form thing is supposed to be my boat. You can see that it's light in the intaglio one and it's black in the relief one. And that's the real basics of what we're doing. Relief, it's in the high point, and then with the intaglio, I try to wipe the ink off the high point. But there's also sort of a lot of other things, like the intaglio one just has more, usually it's darker. You can get it lighter, you can sort of play with it, but also there's things where certain surfaces, the ink wipes off easier than other surfaces. So you'll notice in the intaglio one, the buildings are different colors, whereas in the relief one, they're all the same color. That's because what I built the material out of, the ink is absorbing in one and not absorbing in the other. So you get lots of nuances in the intaglio, whereas the relief one is just sort of like, it's really punchy, it really has nice darks and lights, but sometimes it doesn't have that nuance of color that the intaglio one has. It also just like, sometimes they can look like different times of day, sometimes it can be sort of different moods. The next thing that I would do, and I'm not going to do it in front of you guys right now, but the next thing that I would do is that I would take both of those things, I would look at them carefully, and I would decide, what do I like from this one? What do I like from the other one? What do I want to pull out? It's very hard to get back to that first one. It might be easy if I let it dry for a few days and then relief it again. But basically, you kind of have one shot to make that first one. And then now it's a matter of sort of wiping things more. What do I want to bring out? Maybe I want my sky to be brighter. Maybe I want the boat to be black in the end, and then I would relief roll it. Because now you can do both. You can wipe everything away and you can relief roll certain things. So the third one, I want you to make one, relief roll it. That's the first one. I want you to make another one that's as much as you can an intaglio roll where you put the ink deep. And then I want you to make a third where you pick things that you like from either or, and you sort of make a third one that sort of combines elements of both. There's a couple, okay. Another thing is hopefully I think we started to resolve, I lessened the pressure a little bit. I soaked the paper a little less. So I'm going to suggest to you that maybe the paper is soaked for like 4 minutes rather than 20 minutes. Just put it in right, like leave it in there a few minutes and then get it right back out. And I think that will solve most of the ripping problem. If it doesn't, and if you get a little ripping, the thing that I would do when it dries is that I would just go in with some like black India ink or something. And some of those areas where the paper ripped and I want it to be black, I would just go in and like bend that a little bit. I'm going to show you one more thing before we break, and that's how to clean up. So these would be on the drying rack, they would be drying. We always stop class a half an hour before 5:30. We always stop class and we start to clean. If you finish your prints earlier than 5:30, of course, you can clean up your area. You can make room for somebody else. Yes.
1 o'clock. Yeah.
I'm sorry. We had class at 1 o'clock. So 12:30 is when cleanup starts. Thank you. We're gonna be here till 5 o'clock. So half hour before end of class, we start the cleanup time. Of course, if you end early, you can take your gloves, clean your area, make room for somebody else. Even if you've done that though, I want you to come back in at 12:30 and see what else needs to be done. But let's go through one time. We're gonna go through really clearly what cleanup means and what it is. I would, if I'm cleaning up my stuff, of course, I would put everything on the drying rack, I would clean the table, I would throw away any little scraps of paper that I had, all of that stuff I would make sure is squared away. Anything that has ink on it like this amount of ink is flammable, and it needs to go in the red containers right here. This stuff is flammable and hazardous, and it has to go in the red container. If I could scooch around here, I have one of those red containers, that goes in the red container. Something like, I don't know, if this had a little bit of ink on it, a little bit, it's not a blob, it's a little bit of ink, this can go just in a regular trash can. So all my little scraps of paper, all that stuff can go regular. Blobs of ink, anything with solvent, red container, just paper, that container. This thing is not garbage at all. This tarlatan fabric is kept in that beige container on top of the flammable cabinet. So that's still, we're gonna keep that. What I would do here, I guess I'm just gonna clean this up so that you can actually, see it all getting cleaned. I'll leave like one blob. What I do here, I'm gonna get one magical tool that you guys will love. And it's in this drawer over here. So let me see here. There's a couple versions of it. This is a razor scraper made to clean ink off of glass. And it's like the most magical tool of all. What I usually do before I even use the razor scraper is I just use my palette knife and I clean that up like this. That way, I know, and another thing that I like to do is I take the edge of the table, my palette knife, and I sort of scrape down like that to make sure that as much ink as I can get onto this piece of paper before I even take out the solvent, the better. So I've done that. That's like getting pretty good. Now I take my razor scraper and I can really almost like clean the whole surface without even getting out the solvent. I'm going to go down the edges of here. I'm going to keep that that blob of ink out for everybody else printing. One thing that I would suggest though, like if you guys are, cleaning up your area, you're done and you're going to go back in the other room, just make sure it's like a neat pile. This thing tends to like expand and grow throughout the day. So just kind of like get it back into a little bit of a pile for the next crowd that comes in. And actually we'll just keep that right there. But I will sort of razor scrape down that edge so that it's a more concise pile. Now this thing, of course, goes in the flammable thing. It's got blobs of ink on it. That's very flammable. That's going to go in here. And now it's time for our GAMSOL to come out. Not before everything is pretty, squared away. So now the GAMSOL comes out. I just need a little bit of it on the table. I would say like, I don't know, what's that, like a 1/4 ounce or something on the table. Tablespoon. And then the GAMSOL really gets it up. It just be really conservative with everything that you use in here. The inks, the GAMSOL, the paper towels. Just try to sort of stretch the materials. Even with the paper towels, it's like I could take this paper towel, I could throw that right in the thing, or I could kind of, rearrange it a little bit so that I can use a clean area and clean all of that up. I could use my same paper towel to clean my razor scraper, my brush. This stuff I'm going to leave out for a little bit. And another sort of trick, you guys could bring in, if you want to bring in your own rollers, you could. There's also a lot of rollers in the in a drawer under the paper table. I think a good trick for the rollers is to take a piece of newsprint and put some GAMSOL on there, and you can sort of get a lot of the ink off like that before you start to wipe it off with a paper towel. Try to remember like what your just like having roommates, the shop is a lot like having 25 roommates. Always do a little more than you want your area to be a little cleaner than you found it. I want this roller to be a little nicer than when I found it. Just, in interest of the community running well, always just do a little bit more, leave yourself enough time to do it. If you made like a huge mess and you think you might need more than a half hour to clean it up, start earlier and just make sure it's done. I might work on this a little bit more, but this roller that I got out of there was actually pretty, some of them are purely black when you get them out of there. And you probably won't be able to get it back to the rubber color, but do as good a job as you can. And of course, anything with solvent and ink on it, of course, goes in the red bin. Okay, any questions about all this stuff, about cleaning, about printing? Yes.
If I wanted to, I only brought one Stonehenge paper for
Yes.
today. If I wanted to print on a newsprint or any other paper, for sure I could start on that.
Yes.
Okay, and I had one more. When I put the ink on the plate, how long do I have before it's dry?
You have hours.
Oh, okay.
Like you really, it's better to, that's what's great about this ink. You have, I mean, maybe not hours, you at least have like 20 minutes.
Okay.
So you don't have to, it's not like, yeah, you can walk away from it. You can prepare your paper carefully.
Okay.
But that is a great point about paper. Of course, your Stonehenge is expensive. You want to make sure things are going well before you do it. You might even just want to practice running it through the press on newsprint. You can use newsprint. You can also always use any of this paper that's under the table. Yes.
Oh, I would also brought newsprint to your purposes, but the only thing is, you say they only have one chance to do the relief.
Right.
Right.
That's true. Do your relief on your Stonehenge.
The first print.
So what you might want to do is take your Stonehenge, like a good process would be take your Stonehenge, cut it all up, soak one piece and do your relief on it. I mean, that's not exactly true. You could try your relief on a piece of newsprint, but what's harder to do is to go all the way through intaglio and then back to relief. But you could probably try it on a newsprint before you do it. And it might just be good to try on another piece of paper just so you can practice the whole shebang, whatever. The only thing is, this paper under here doesn't soak. Don't soak newsprint or don't soak that. It'll just fall apart if you put it in the sink. So, but it's so thin that it will give you a good impression on the, without soaking it. So if you want to use any of that, use as much of it as you want, and that's yours to experiment with. What else?
So if God forbid some ink got there, so we're cleaning with the Gamsol too.
Yes,
Okay.
if you, yeah, and yes, keep clean that with Gamsol too. Yeah. And also, like, if you start to notice, like, oh, I keep coming over to this press and there's ink on the hand, just, clean that stuff up too. So I would just make sure at the end of my session, when I'm walking away from it, that all of my, my print area is clean, my table is clean. And of course, at the end of the day, we are all making sure that everything is cleaned up and fresh. I give myself like maybe a B- in cleaning today. I'm not getting good grades today, but I'm gonna get better, and it's gonna be great. And I think what I'll do is I'm gonna spend some time answering questions if anybody has specific plate. Oh wait, here's what I want to know. Okay, I think of us probably being in like 3 categories today. One category is I'm ready to print, sounds great, you know what you're doing, you don't need any, you can just start printing. Is there anybody in that category? Yes. Oh my God, amazing. Then category 2 is you're basically ready to print and you just have a couple questions and then you can get started. And category 2 is who I want to talk to next if you just need like a few more things and then you're basically ready to go. And category 3, this is not a bad category to be in. Category 3 is you still need to work on your plate. That stuff's not done. If you have any lingering questions about like your kit, your plate, all of that stuff, have no fear. It was a crazy week and you still have all of next week as a work period. So category 3 people, totally fine. and we have tons of time to talk today. So our class goes to 1 o'clock. At 12:30, we're gonna start to clean. So, well, yeah, so we have a pretty good amount of time. So yeah, that's the story. I think that's it.
Are we taking a break now or are we just going?
Yeah, if you want to take a break, you can take a break. If somebody wants to jump right on the press, you can. I guess the thing about break, and I think I tried to say this in the first class, but here's my policy with breaks. Usually what happens is the beginning of class, I like have announcements, I do a demo. The end of class, of course, is your cleanup period. You can take a break at any time in between those two things. The beginning of class, I want you to be here. The end of class, well,